As the day quietly fades and stars begin to whisper above, welcome to Korean History Whispers. Tonight, we gently explore the heart and mind of Kang Gam-chan, while history remembers his victories. Tonight you will feel the pulse of the man behind the legend. Close your eyes and let his whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep, in the year 948. As autumn painted the Korean peninsula in shades of gold and crimson, something extraordinary happened in the hills south of what would one day become Seoul. The night sky, usually serene and predictable, suddenly blazed with unexpected fire. A star, brilliant and defiant, tore itself from the heavens and plummeted toward Earth like a celestial arrow seeking its target. The royal messenger, riding through the countryside on routine business, pulled his horse to a sudden halt. Above him, the falling star carved a blazing trail across the darkness before vanishing behind a cluster of humble homes. Something deep in his chest told him this was no ordinary celestial event. This was a sign, a portent of something momentous about to unfold. Following an instinct he couldn't name, the messenger guided his horse toward the place where the star had fallen. There, in a modest dwelling that seemed to glow with residual starlight, he discovered the source of the cosmic disturbance. A child had been born at the exact moment the star kissed the earth. Not just any child, but a boy whose eyes seemed to hold the wisdom of ages yet to come. The messenger's hands trembled as he realized what he had witnessed. This was no coincidence. Heaven itself had announced the arrival of someone destined to shake the very foundations of the world. Without hesitation, he gathered the infant and his family, knowing that this child belonged not to a simple farming village, but to history itself. His newborn, initially named Yunchun, would grow to become Kang Gam-chan, the man who would one day stand as an unbreakable wall against the mightiest invasion force ever assembled against Korea. But in that moment, as his mother cradled him in the afterglow of celestial fire, he was simply a baby whose arrival had been heralded by the stars themselves. The child's family traced their roots back 5 generations to Kang Il-chong, who had journeyed from the ancient kingdom of Silla to settle in this region of Guiju. They were people of modest means but proud heritage. Farmers and scholars who understood that true nobility came not from titles but from character forged in adversity. Young Yunchun's father, Kang Gam-chan, had already distinguished himself in service to King Taejong, the founder of the Goryeo Dynasty. Though records of his specific deeds remain shrouded in the mists of time, his eventual recognition as one of the sacred merit subjects of the 3 Han kingdoms spoke to extraordinary courage and sacrifice. He had helped birth a new era, and now his son would be called upon to defend it. From his earliest days, the boy who would become Kang Gam-chan displayed an insatiable hunger for knowledge. While other children played with wooden toys and chased butterflies through rice fields, he could be found hunched over scrolls, his young mind devouring every character like a starving man consuming bread. His teachers marveled at his ability to grasp complex concepts that challenged scholars twice his age. The ancient texts spoke to him in ways that transcended mere academic study. Military treatises revealed their tactical secrets. Historical chronicles whispered lessons about the rise and fall of dynasties. Philosophical works opened doorways to understanding the deeper currents that moved nations and shaped destinies. Knowledge wasn't just something he acquired. It was something that flowed through his very essence. As Yunchun matured into adolescence, his reputation as a scholar of exceptional promise spread throughout the region. Teachers who had initially been skeptical of the rural boy's potential found themselves humbled by his intellectual prowess. He possessed that rare combination of brilliant analytical mind and profound intuitive wisdom that marked the truly great strategists of history. The imperial examinations loomed ahead like a mountain to be climbed. These grueling tests, administered by the kingdom's most respected scholars, represented the gateway to political power and social advancement. For a young man from the countryside, Success would mean transformation from obscurity to influence, from watching history unfold to actively shaping its course. In 983, at the age of 35, Yunchen stood before the examination hall with hundreds of other hopeful candidates. The weight of his family's expectations, his own burning ambitions, and perhaps the memory of that falling star all pressed upon his shoulders. The examination questions were designed to separate the merely intelligent from the truly exceptional, testing not only memorized knowledge, but the ability to apply wisdom to complex real-world scenarios. Hour after hour, his brush moved across the paper with confident precision. Each character flowed from his mind through his hand like water finding its natural course. Military strategy, administrative policy, historical analysis, philosophical interpretation. Every challenge the examiners presented seemed to unlock new chambers of understanding within his consciousness. When the results were announced, the name at the very top of the list was his own. Not merely successful, but the supreme victor. The Jiangwan who had outperformed every other candidate in the kingdom. The boy born under a falling star had proven that celestial portents sometimes do predict earthly triumph. The examination had been overseen by some of the most formidable intellectual figures of the age. Choi Sung-no and Lee Monju, scholars whose reputations commanded respect throughout East Asia, had crafted the questions and evaluated the responses. Even King Seongjong himself had personally conducted the final round of testing. For young Yunchen to emerge victorious from such prestigious oversight meant that his talents had been recognized at the very highest levels of the kingdom. It was some time after this magnificent achievement that he chose to change his name from Yunchen to Gam-chan. The transformation was symbolic, marking his evolution from promising student to accomplished scholar, official ready to serve his nation. The new name would echo through the corridors of power, and eventually thunder across battlefields, where the fate of Korea itself hung in the balance. His early career unfolded during the reigns of King Seongjong and his successor, King Mokjeong. These were years of gradual advancement, steady promotion through the administrative ranks that formed the backbone of Goryeo governance. He progressed methodically from junior positions to more senior roles, finally achieving the rank of courtesy assistant in the Ministry of Rights. Each position taught him new aspects of statecraft, new understanding of how kingdoms function both in times of peace and moments of crisis. But destiny was preparing a far greater stage for Kang Gam-chan's talents. To the north, beyond the Yalu River, the mighty Khitan Empire was consolidating its power and casting covetous eyes toward the Korean peninsula. These were not merely another nomadic tribe seeking easy plunder, but a sophisticated military machine capable of challenging the greatest powers of East Asia. The Khitans had already demonstrated their formidable capabilities by forcing the Song dynasty of China into humiliating terms after reaching the very gates of the Chinese capital. Their cavalry could strike with lightning speed across vast distances. Their siege engines could reduce the mightiest fortifications to rubble. Their diplomatic corps was skilled at exploiting political divisions within enemy kingdoms. For now, an uneasy peace existed between Goryeo and the Khitan Empire, maintained by the brilliant negotiations of the diplomat Seo Hui, following the first Khitan invasion in 993. The agreement had established the Yalu River as the boundary between the two powers, with Goryeo acknowledging Khitan supremacy in exchange for territorial concessions and political autonomy. But peace treaties written on paper proved fragile things when imperial ambitions burned hot in the hearts of conquerors. The Khitans viewed their arrangement with Goryeo not as a permanent settlement, but as a temporary pause before the final subjugation of the peninsula. They were simply waiting for the proper moment, the ideal pretext, to complete what they had begun. That moment was approaching faster than anyone in the Goryeo court realized. Political upheaval was brewing within the kingdom itself, the kind of internal weakness that invited external predation. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test everything Kang Gam-chan had learned from his books and scrolls. The star that had fallen to Earth 35 years earlier had been no mere celestial accident. It had been an announcement, a declaration that heaven was preparing its chosen instrument for the trial that lay ahead. The boy born under that blazing herald was now a man of knowledge and position, ready to face the greatest challenge his kingdom had ever confronted. In the quiet moments between his administrative duties, Kang Gam-chan sometimes looked northward toward the distant mountains that marked the border with Khitan territory. Something in his scholar's intuition whispered that those peaks would soon echo with the thunder of war drums and the clash of armies. When that moment came, all his years of study and preparation would be distilled into decisions that would determine whether Goryeo survived as an independent kingdom, or disappeared forever into the vast expanse of the Khitan Empire. The falling star had marked his beginning. Soon, the rising sun would illuminate his destiny. As shadows lengthen and the world grows quiet, we return to the whispered chronicles of Kang Gam-chan. Tonight, we witness the gathering storm that would test not just one man's courage, but the very soul of a nation. While the thunder of approaching armies echoes through history, you will feel the weight of impossible choices that shaped a kingdom's fate. The year 993 had brought Korea face to face with its greatest external threat since the kingdom's founding. From beyond the northern mountains came an invasion for unlike anything the peninsula had ever witnessed. These were not raiders seeking quick plunder, but the disciplined legions of the Khitan Empire, a military machine that had already humbled the mighty Song dynasty of China. The Khitan army moved like a living avalanche across the landscape, their mounted archers flowing around Korean defensive positions with deadly precision. Traditional fortifications that had protected Goryeo for generations crumbled before siege engines of terrifying efficiency. Panic spread through the countryside as refugees fled southward with tales of unstoppable destruction. But when total catastrophe seemed inevitable, an unlikely hero emerged from the ranks of Goryeo's diplomatic corps. Seo Hui, a scholar, official whose weapon was words rather than swords, requested permission to meet the Khitan commander under a flag of truce. What transpired in that tent would alter the course of East Asian history. With the eloquence of a master strategist and the cunning of a chess grandmaster, Seo Hui wove together arguments that gradually shifted the entire framework of the conflict. He painted vivid pictures of the costs of continued warfare, the benefits of peaceful coexistence, and the strategic advantages that both empires could gain through cooperation, rather than conquest. Hour by hour, day by day, Seo Hui's diplomatic genius worked its magic. The Khitan leadership found themselves reconsidering their original objectives. What had begun as a straightforward military campaign evolved into complex negotiations that would reshape the political landscape of the region. The final agreement established the Yalu River as the boundary between the two powers. Goryeo would acknowledge Khitan supremacy and send tribute to the Northern Empire. In return, the Khitans would withdraw their forces and recognize Goryeo's right to govern its own territory. Most significantly, Goryeo would sever its diplomatic ties with the Song dynasty, eliminating a major source of Khitan strategic anxiety. For 15 years, this delicate balance held. Tribute missions traveled northward carrying silk, gold, and formal acknowledgments of Khitan superiority. In return, Goryeo enjoyed peace and the freedom to develop its internal affairs without external interference. Trade flourished along the northern border. Cultural exchanges enriched both civilizations. But beneath this surface tranquility, deeper currents were stirring that would eventually shatter the carefully constructed peace. The Khitan Empire was entering a period of unprecedented military confidence. Their recent campaigns against the Song dynasty had proven devastatingly successful, forcing the Chinese to agree to humiliating annual payments of silver and silk. Emperor Shenzong of the Khitans and his formidable mother, the regent Empress Dowager Chengxin, had personally led their armies to the very gates of Kaifeng, the Song capital. Only desperate Chinese resistance and the logistical challenges of maintaining such an extended campaign had prevented complete victory. The peace treaty signed at Shanyuan in 1004 had left the Khitans as the dominant power in Northeast Asia. His triumph over China transformed Khitan's strategic thinking regarding Korea. What had once been viewed as a useful but secondary relationship now appeared as an opportunity for further expansion. If the mighty Song dynasty could be forced to pay tribute, surely the smaller kingdom of Goryeo could be compelled to offer even greater submission. The pretext for renewed aggression came from an unexpected source: internal Korean politics. The death of King Mokjong in 1009 had triggered a succession crisis that provided the Khitans with exactly the justification they needed to intervene. The crisis began when a powerful military commander named Kang Gam-chan launched a coup against King Mokjong. Alleging incompetence and corruption in the royal administration, the rebellion succeeded with shocking swiftness. But its aftermath proved far more complex than Kang Gam-chan had anticipated. King Mokjong was not merely deposed but murdered. And a new monarch, King Hyeonjong, was placed on the throne. From the Khitan perspective, this violent transition represented an unacceptable breach of the established order. They had recognized Mokjong as the legitimate ruler of Goryeo under the terms of their treaty. His assassination by rebels constituted an act of treachery that voided all previous agreements and justified immediate military intervention. The situation grew even more volatile when Jurchen tribes along the northern border, taking advantage of the chaos in Goryeo, began conducting raids and then fled to Khitan territory when Korean forces pursued them. These Jurchen refugees brought with them inflammatory stories designed to convince the Khitans that Goryeo was preparing for war and could not be trusted to honor any agreements. Emperor Shenzong declared the murder of King Mokjong to be an act of treason against the established order of East Asia. In his proclamation of war, he characterized the Korean rebels as criminals who had violated the sacred bonds between ruler and subject. The Khitan Empire, as the dominant power in the region, had both the right and the responsibility to restore legitimate governance to the peninsula. The declaration meant that negotiation was no longer possible. Unlike the previous conflict, which had been resolved through Seohu's diplomatic brilliance, this new crisis would be settled exclusively through military force. The Khitans were coming not as conquerors seeking tribute, but as avengers determined to punish treachery and install a government of their own choosing. In the winter of 1010, Emperor Shenzong personally took command of the largest army ever assembled for an invasion of Korea. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of thousands of troops, including the elite cavalry units that had terrorized Chinese armies, siege specialists capable of reducing any fortification, and supply trains sufficient to sustain a prolonged campaign deep in enemy territory. The Korean response was tragically inadequate. Despite having 17 years to prepare for the possibility of renewed conflict, Goryeo's military leadership proved catastrophically unprepared for the scale and intensity of the Khitan assault. The very success of Seohu's earlier diplomacy had perhaps bred a dangerous complacency among those responsible for national defense. Kang Gam-chan, the military strongman whose coup had provided the Khitans with their justification for war, now found himself forced to confront the consequences of his political ambitions. He assembled what forces he could and marched northward to meet the invasion. But his strategic planning proved disastrously flawed from the beginning. Instead of adopting defensive tactics that might have exploited Korea's mountainous terrain and the Khitans' extended supply lines, Kang Gam-chan attempted to meet the invaders in open battle, where their superior numbers and cavalry advantage could be fully utilized. The result was predictably catastrophic. The Korean army disintegrated under the overwhelming pressure of the Khitan assault. Kang Gam-chan himself was captured alive, his dreams of military glory ending in humiliating defeat and captivity. With the main Korean force destroyed, Nothing stood between the Khitan army and the kingdom's major population centers.
Site after city fell to the advancing invaders.
Pyongyang,
the western capital that had once been the heart of ancient Korean civilization,
surrendered without resistance. The Khitan forces continued their relentless advance southward, their confidence growing with each easy victory. In the royal capital of Gyeongsang, panic gripped both the court and the common people. Refugees streaming in from the north brought horrifying tales of Khitan brutality and the complete collapse of Korean resistance. Many courtiers began advocating immediate surrender as the only way to prevent total annihilation. It was at this moment of absolute crisis that Kang Gam-chan stepped forward to change the course of history. While others counseled despair or capitulation, his voice cut through the chaos with calm authority and strategic wisdom. His analysis of the situation was brutally realistic but not without hope.
The immediate military disaster was indeed Kang Jo's fault,
the result of poor planning and tactical incompetence. But the war itself was far from over.
The Khitans might have achieved early victories, but they were now operating at the end of extremely long supply lines in hostile territory, during the harshest season of the year.
More importantly, Kang Gam-chan understood that the Khitan strategy depended on achieving rapid, decisive victory. Their army was too large to sustain indefinitely in enemy territory. If Goryeo could avoid a catastrophic final battle and instead force the conflict into a prolonged campaign, the advantage would gradually shift toward the defenders. His recommendation was as bold as it was controversial. King Hyunjong should abandon the capital and retreat southward, drawing the Khitan forces deeper into the peninsula, while avoiding the climactic battle they desperately needed. It was a strategy that required enormous courage and faith, trading immediate territory for long-term survival. The king accepted this radical advice, and one of the most extraordinary royal flights in Korean history began. With only a handful of loyal retainers, Hyunjong abandoned his palace and fled southward, leaving the capital to its fate, but preserving the symbols and legitimacy of royal authority. The journey was a nightmare of hardship and uncertainty. Winter roads turned to frozen mud beneath their feet. Food was scarce and shelter uncertain. At any moment, Khitan cavalry could appear on the horizon to end their escape permanently. Yet with each mile they traveled away from Gyeongsang, the strategic balance shifted slightly in their favor. Behind them, the Khitan army occupied the abandoned capital, in what should have been a moment of total triumph. But instead of celebrating the end of the war, they found themselves rulers of an empty city in the middle of hostile territory with winter closing in around them. The Korean government still existed somewhere to the south, and as long as it remained free, the conquest remained incomplete. The brilliance of Kang Gam-chan's strategy became apparent as weeks turned into months. Isolated Korean forces, no longer required to defend fixed positions, began launching hit and run attacks against Khitan supply convoys. The invaders found themselves fighting a war without front lines, facing an enemy that appeared and disappeared like morning mist. Gradually, the psychological momentum shifted. What had begun as a triumphant invasion was becoming a costly occupation. The Khitan forces, far from home and facing constant harassment, began to lose the confidence that had carried them to initial victory. Eventually, Emperor Shenzong was forced to acknowledge the reality of his situation. He could occupy Korean territory, but he could not destroy Korean resistance. A negotiated settlement became preferable to an indefinite military commitment with uncertain prospects for success. The resulting peace agreement required King Hyunjong to promise personal submission to the Khitan court, but it also secured the withdrawal of the invasion force. As the enemy army retreated northward, Korean forces under commanders like Yang Ji-wei struck repeated blows against the exhausted columns, extracting a heavy price for the temporary occupation. When the crisis finally ended, Kang Gam-chan found himself recognized as the man whose wisdom had saved the kingdom.
His counsel to retreat rather than fight had seemed like cowardice to many at the time. But history had vindicated his strategic judgment. King Hyunjung would later write personally that Kang Gam-chan's advice had prevented the entire nation from falling into barbarian hands. Yet even as Goryeo celebrated its survival, Kang Gam-chan understood that the reprieve was only temporary. The Khitans had been frustrated, not defeated. Their fundamental strategic objectives remained unchanged, and their military capabilities were undiminished. The next confrontation was not a matter of if, but when, in the quiet moments after the crisis. As he reflected on the lessons of the recent campaign, Kang Gam-chan began to envision a different kind of response to future Khitan aggression. Retreat and evasion had saved the kingdom once, but they could not be relied upon indefinitely. Next time, Goryeo would need to be prepared not just to survive invasion, but to inflict such devastating casualties that the Khitans would never again consider Korean conquest a viable option. The eagles were still circling overhead, their predatory gaze unchanged. But the prey they sought was no longer helpless and vulnerable. Deep in the mountains of southern Korea, a brilliant mind was already planning the campaign that would transform hunters into hunted. As moonlight dances across ancient battlefields, we return once more to the saga of Kang Gam-chan. Tonight, we witness the gathering of storm clouds that would birth the greatest military confrontation in Korean history. While the wolf prepares for its final hunt, you will feel the quiet determination that transforms ordinary men into legends. The years following the Second Khitan invasion had transformed Kang Gam-chan from a respected scholar into one of the most influential figures in the Goryeo court. His strategic wisdom during the crisis had earned him rapid promotion through the highest ranks of government, each new position bringing greater responsibility and deeper insight into the art of statecraft. By 1011, he held the prestigious position of Chancellor of the National Academy, followed by appointments as Hanlin Scholar and Left Cavalier, Attendant, in Ordinary. His elevation to the Central Secretariat marked his emergence as a key architect of national policy. But it was his assignment as Military Commissioner of the Northeast Circuit that revealed the true direction of his growing influence. This posting was no ceremonial honor, but a recognition that Kang Gam-chan possessed the rare combination of intellectual brilliance and practical military judgment that Korea desperately needed. The northeast frontier was where the next Khitan assault would inevitably come, and the kingdom's survival might well depend on the preparations he made there. During these years of relative peace, Kang Gam-chan threw himself into the unglamorous but essential work of military preparation. He studied every aspect of Khitan tactics, analyzing their strengths and identifying potential weaknesses. He examined the terrain along the northern border, searching for positions where Korean forces might gain advantage over an invading army. Most importantly, he began to envision a new kind of defensive strategy that would go far beyond the retreats and evasions that had saved the kingdom during the previous invasion. Goryeo had survived the Second Khitan assault, but survival alone was not victory. The next time the wolves came hunting, they would find their prey transformed into something far more dangerous. His opportunity to implement broader reforms came in 1018, when he was elevated to the exalted position of military governor of the western capital and chancellor of the Secretariat. This appointment placed him among the highest range officials in the kingdom, with authority to coordinate military preparations across multiple regions. The western capital of Pyongyang was strategically crucial, serving as the forward bastion against northern invasion. From this position, Kang Gam-chan could oversee the training of troops, the stockpiling of supplies, and the construction of fortifications that would channel any future Khitan advance into killing zones of his own design. He also used his influence to propose seemingly minor reforms that revealed his long-term strategic thinking. His suggestion to repair the royal ancestral shrine and reorganize its ceremonial protocols was not mere bureaucratic housekeeping. but a way to strengthen the spiritual and political foundations of royal authority that would be essential during future crises. Even more revealing was his personal decision to distribute his own farmland among military families. This gesture demonstrated his understanding that effective defense required not just professional soldiers, but a population with personal stakes in the kingdom's survival. Men who owned land would fight more fiercely to defend it than mercenaries serving only for pay. Meanwhile, far to the north, the Khitan Empire was wrestling with the frustrating aftermath of their incomplete victory in 1010. Emperor Changzong had achieved his immediate objective of forcing King Haiyang to acknowledge Khitan supremacy. But the deeper goal of Korean submission remained elusive. The promised royal visit to the Khitan court had never materialized. King Haiyang cited illness as his excuse for avoiding the journey. But everyone understood this was diplomatic fiction designed to maintain Korean independence while technically honoring the peace agreement. Each postponement was a small humiliation for the mighty empire that claimed dominion over all of Northeast Asia. More seriously, from the Khitan perspective, Goryeo's behavior along the frontier suggested anything but genuine submission. Korean forces had reoccupied territories lost during the invasion, and were actively fortifying positions that clearly served defensive rather than ceremonial purposes. Trade relationships that should have reflected tributary status remain frustratingly equal, rather than exploitative. The final provocation came with Khitan demands for the surrender of the Gangdong 6 prefectures, fertile territories along the Yalu River, that the empire claimed as compensation for the costs of their previous invasion. Goryeo's flat rejection of these demands made clear that King Haiyang had no intention of honoring his forced promises any longer than absolutely necessary. Sporadic border clashes escalated throughout 1017 as both sides tested each other's resolve and capabilities. Korean forces generally performed well in these limited engagements, successfully defending most contested positions. However, the loss of strategic river crossings around modern-day Guiju demonstrated that Goryeo still faced serious military challenges when confronting Khitan forces directly. The pattern of these skirmishes convinced Emperor Shenzong that half measures and diplomatic pressure would never achieve his objectives. If Korea was to be truly subdued, it would require another massive military campaign designed not merely to extract political concessions, but to destroy Goryeo's capacity for future resistance entirely. The third invasion would be the largest and most devastating assault ever launched against the Korean peninsula. Unlike previous campaigns that had achieved early success through surprise and overwhelming force, this operation would be meticulously planned to anticipate and counter every possible form of Korean resistance. Commandage of this final campaign was entrusted to Xiao Tia, one of the most accomplished military commanders in the Khitan Empire. He was the older brother of Xiaozhen, who had led the first invasion against Korea in 993, and had proven his strategic brilliance in campaigns against the Song dynasty that had forced Chinese submission. Zhao Pei's reputation was built on his ability to combine overwhelming force with sophisticated tactical flexibility. His armies moved with lightning speed when rapid advance was required, but could also settle into methodical siege operations when necessary. Most importantly, he possessed the political authority to make strategic decisions without constantly referring back to the imperial court. The force assembled for this invasion dwarfed anything seen in previous campaigns. Contemporary sources speak of an army numbering over 100,000 men, including the elite cavalry units that formed the core of Khitan military power, engineers capable of reducing any fortification, siege equipment that could breach the strongest walls, and supply trains sufficient for an extended campaign deep in enemy territory. Xiao Pei's strategic plan was elegantly simple. Advance as rapidly as possible toward the Korean capital, forcing the defenders into a decisive battle before they could implement the evasive tactics that had frustrated the previous invasion. Speed and overwhelming force would prevent Goryeo from repeating their earlier strategy of trading space for time. The invasion began in the winter of 1018, with Khitan forces crossing the Yalu River in multiple columns designed to maximize the speed of their advance, while preventing Korean forces from concentrating their defenses at any single point. The initial progress was everything Xiaopaya had hoped for, with Korean border fortifications falling quickly to his veteran troops. Notice of the invasion reached the Goryeo court with the terrible swiftness that marked all great disasters. Messengers arrived with reports of overwhelming enemy numbers, the collapse of frontier defenses, and Khitan columns advancing steadily toward the heartland of the kingdom. The nightmare that had haunted Korean strategic planning for nearly a decade was finally becoming reality. King Hyunjong's response demonstrated how completely he had internalized the lessons of the previous crisis. Instead of panic or despair, he moved immediately to implement the comprehensive defensive strategy that Kang Gam-chan had spent years developing. This would not be a repeat of the improvised retreats that had barely saved the kingdom in 1010. The royal command appointing Kang Gam-chan as supreme commander represented the culmination of his remarkable journey from provincial scholar to national leader. At the age of 70, he was being entrusted with the survival of everything he had devoted his life to protecting. The responsibility was staggering, but so was the authority that came with it. His appointment of General Kang Min-cheum as deputy commander created a leadership team that combined Kang Gam-chan's strategic brilliance with proven battlefield experience. The force placed under their command numbered over 200,000 troops, demonstrating the military buildup that had been quietly proceeding during the years of relative peace. Its numerical superiority was itself a testament to the effectiveness of Kang Gam-chan's long-term planning. The Goryeo army that would face Xiaopaya's invasion was not the hastily assembled force that had been destroyed by the previous Khitan assault. This was a professional military organization that had been systematically prepared for exactly this confrontation. The opening moves of the campaign would test every aspect of the defensive strategy that Kang Gam-chan had developed during his years of preparation. Unlike the previous invasion, where Korean forces had been surprised and overwhelmed, this time the defenders would be ready with carefully planned responses to every Khitan tactical move. Kang Gam-chan's initial deployment revealed the sophistication of his strategic thinking. Rather than attempting to meet the invasion with conventional defensive tactics, he positioned substantial cavalry forces in concealed positions near Heunggwa Fortress, creating the possibility for devastating surprise attacks against the advancing Khitan columns. The preparation of artificial flooding systems along the region's waterways demonstrated another dimension of his innovative approach to defensive warfare. By carefully controlling the flow of major streams, Korean forces could create tactical advantages that would transform familiar terrain into death traps for an advancing enemy. As Xiaopaya's army approached the predetermined killing zone, Kang Gam-chan made his final preparations for the opening battle of the campaign. His scouts reported enemy movements with precision, allowing him to time his counter-strike for maximum devastating effect. The wolf was entering the trap, confident in its superior strength, but unaware of the elaborate snare that had been prepared. The moment of contact was approaching when two armies, each supremely confident in its ability to destroy the other, would collide with the force of historical inevitability. Everything that had led to this confrontation, all the political tensions and military preparations and strategic calculations, was about to be tested in the crucible of actual combat. Kang Gam-chan stood at the center of it all. The scholar who had become a warrior, the strategist whose theories were about to face their ultimate examination. In the distance, he could hear the drums of the approaching Khitan army, their rhythm carrying across the winter landscape like the heartbeat of an approaching storm. The wolf had begun its last hunt. But this time, the prey was ready to bite back. As the final stars fade into dawn, we witness the crescendo of our tale. Tonight, we stand beside Kang Gam-chan as destiny unfolds across the plains of Guiju, where the fate of the kingdom hung in the balance of a single, thunderous day. While history carved its judgment in steel and sacrifice, you will feel the weight of choices that echo through eternity. The moment had arrived when all of Kang Gam-chan's years of study, preparation, and strategic planning would be tested in the crucible of actual combat. As Xiaopia's massive invasion force approached the carefully chosen battleground near Hunghua Fortress, the 70-plus-year-old commander felt the familiar calm that descended upon him in moments of supreme crisis. His opening gambit was a masterpiece of tactical deception. 12,000 elite Korean cavalry had been positioned in hidden ravines and valleys throughout the mountainous terrain surrounding the fortress. To the advancing Khitans, the landscape appeared empty and undefended. An open corridor leading directly toward their ultimate objective of the Korean capital. But Kang Gam-chan had transformed this seemingly vacant terrain into an elaborate killing field. The major stream flowing east of the fortress had been secretly dammed using oxygenate barriers, creating an artificial reservoir that could be released at precisely the right moment to devastating effect. Every hill, every valley, every seemingly innocent feature of the landscape had been weaponized. As the Khitan vanguard moved confidently through what they believed to be uncontested territory, Kang Gam-chan gave the signal that would change the course of East Asian history. The High dams burst open simultaneously, sending torrents of icy water cascading down upon the unsuspecting enemy columns. Horses stumbled and fell in the sudden flood. Formation discipline collapsed as riders struggled to maintain control of their panicked mounts. In that moment of chaos and confusion, the hidden Korean cavalry erupted from their concealment like an avalanche of steel and fury. 12,000 mounted warriors, perfectly coordinated and utterly committed, struck the disorganized Khitan forces with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The surprise was so complete, the execution so flawless, that entire enemy units simply ceased to exist. The psychological impact of this devastating ambush rippled through the entire Khitan army. These were veteran troops who had conquered Chinese armies and terrorized half of East Asia. Yet they had been outmaneuvered and humiliated by defenders they had expected to brush aside with contemptuous ease. For the first time in the campaign, doubt began to creep into minds that had previously known only confidence. But Xiaopia was far too experienced a commander to be deterred by a single tactical setback. However spectacular his strategic objective remained unchanged. Reach the Korean capital as quickly as possible, and force a decisive confrontation before the defenders could fully implement their evasive tactics. The loss of troops at Hunghua was painful but not fatal to his overall campaign. The Khitan advance continued with grim determination, but now every mile was purchased with blood. General Kang Min-tiam led pursuing Korean forces in a series of running battles that inflicted steady casualties on the invasion force. At Jiayu, his troops struck another devastating blow against Xiaopia's columns, demonstrating that the ambush at Hunghua had been no mere lucky accident, but part of a comprehensive defensive strategy. The pattern of these engagements revealed the sophistication of Kang Gam-chan's overall plan. Rather than attempting to stop the invasion through a single climactic battle, he was systematically weakening the enemy through a series of carefully orchestrated encounters. Each engagement was designed to inflict maximum casualties, while preserving Korean strength for the ultimate confrontation that he knew was inevitable. At Maitan Ford, General Jo Won led another successful attack that claimed over 10,000 enemy lives, further depleting Xiaopia's already diminished forces. The Khitan commander found himself caught in a strategic nightmare, where every victory carried with it the seeds of ultimate defeat. He was advancing toward his objective, but each mile forward left him weaker and more vulnerable despite these mounting losses. Xiaopia pressed on with the desperate determination of a gambler who had bet everything on a single hand. His calculation was simple: if he could reach and capture the Korean capital, all the tactical defeats along the way would be rendered irrelevant. A swift, decisive victory would restore Khitan prestige, and achieve the strategic objectives that had motivated the entire campaign. The race between destruction and victory intensified as the battered but still formidable Khitan army pushed southward toward the very heart of the Korean kingdom. Behind them lay a trail of devastation and defeat. Ahead lay the prize that could still justify all the sacrifices they had endured. Kang Gam-chan watched this desperate advance with the calculating eyes of a master strategist, who had anticipated every move in the deadly game now unfolding. His intelligence network provided detailed reports of enemy movements, casualties, and morale. More importantly, he understood the psychological pressures that were driving Xiaopaya toward increasingly reckless decisions. As the Khitan force approached within striking distance of the capital, Kang Gam-chan made the crucial decision to reinforce the city's defenses without abandoning his campaign of systematic attrition. He dispatched General Kim Jong-han with 10,000 fresh troops to strengthen the capital's garrison, ensuring that even if Xiaopaya succeeded in reaching his objective, he would face a properly prepared defense. Additional reinforcements from the Northeast Circuit added another 3,000 troops to the capital's defenses, creating a formidable force capable of withstanding even a determined siege. But Kang Gam-chan's real masterstroke was his decision to ensure that King Hyunjong would not repeat the panicked flight that had characterized the previous invasion. This time, there would be no royal retreat to draw the Khitans deeper into the peninsula. Instead, the king would remain in his capital, implementing a scorched earth policy that denied the invaders the supplies they desperately needed while demonstrating the unshakable resolve of the Korean government. Every citizen who could not fight was evacuated into the safety of the city's walls, leaving the surrounding countryside empty of everything that might sustain an occupying army. The futility of Xiaopaya's position became apparent when his scout units probed the approaches to the capital. A force of 300 Khitan cavalry, sent to reconnoiter the defenses around Jumyo Station, was completely annihilated by a mere 100 Korean defenders, who struck with the precision and ferocity that had characterized every engagement of the campaign. A small but symbolically crucial defeat finally convinced Xiaopaya that his strategic situation had become untenable. His army was too weakened to conduct a successful siege of a properly defended city. His supply lines were too extended to sustain a prolonged campaign. Winter was tightening its grip on the peninsula, creating additional logistical challenges that threatened to destroy his force, even without further military defeats. The decision to retreat was perhaps the most difficult that Xiaopaya had ever made. It represented the acknowledgement that everything he had sacrificed, every tactical victory he had achieved, every mile he had conquered, had ultimately proven insufficient to achieve his strategic objectives. The invasion that was supposed to have completed the Khitan conquest of Korea was ending in failure and humiliation. But Kang Gam-chan was not content to simply watch his enemies withdraw in defeat. He understood that this retreat represented his greatest opportunity to inflict such devastating casualties that the Khitans would never again consider Korean conquest a viable strategic option. The invasion had to end not just in failure, but in catastrophe so complete that it would deter future aggression for generations. The pursuit began immediately, with Korean forces harassing the retreating columns at every opportunity. At Yenju and Guiju, coordinated attacks claimed hundreds of enemy lives, while demonstrating the complete collapse of Khitan tactical effectiveness. But these preliminary engagements were merely preparation for the main event that Kang Gam-chan was orchestrating. The plains around Guiju provided the perfect setting for the climactic battle that would determine not just the outcome of the current campaign, but the future relationship between the Korean and Khitan empires. Here, on terrain that favored neither side decisively, the two armies would meet in the kind of direct confrontation that Xiaopaya had sought throughout the entire campaign. The irony was palpable. After weeks of frustrating pursuit and evasion, the Korean commander was finally offering the decisive battle that his opponent had desperately wanted. But the circumstances had been completely reversed. Where Korea had once possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and tactical momentum, he now faced a larger, better positioned enemy force with his own troops demoralized and exhausted. The battle lines formed with the inexorable weight of historical destiny. On one side stood the remnants of the once mighty Khitan invasion force. Their banners still proud, but their ranks tragically depleted by weeks of constant combat. On the other side, the Korean army presented a picture of disciplined confidence. Their formations perfect and their morale unshakable. Kang Gam-chan rode along the Korean lines, his presence serving as a visible reminder of the strategic brilliance that had brought them to this moment of opportunity. At 70 years of age, he embodied the transformation of his entire kingdom from victim to victor, from prey to predator. The scholar who had once advised retreat now commanded the mightiest military force in Korean history. The opening phases of the battle were fierce beyond description, with both armies fighting with the desperate intensity of men who understood that everything they valued hung in the balance. The Khitans fought with the courage of veterans who refused to accept defeat, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The Koreans fought with the fury of defenders protecting their homeland against foreign invasion. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain as the two forces hammered each other with relentless determination. Cavalry charges shattered against infantry formations only to reform and attack again. Archers darkened the sky with clouds of arrows that fell like deadly rain upon both armies. The thunder of combat echoed across the plains like the voice of heaven itself, pronouncing judgment upon the affairs of mortals. The turning point came when General Kim Jong-hyun arrived with his reinforcements at the crucial moment when the battle could have tipped either way. The fresh Korean troops struck the exhausted Khitan flanks with devastating effect, finally breaking the resistance that had kept the invasion force intact, despite all their previous defeats. The collapse, when it came, was as sudden and complete as an avalanche. Khitan formations that had maintained their discipline through weeks of retreat finally disintegrated under the overwhelming pressure of coordinated Korean attacks. What had been an army became a mob of fleeing individuals concerned only with personal survival. The pursuit that followed was merciless in its efficiency. Korean cavalry units, finally free to operate in open terrain against a broken enemy, extracted terrible vengeance for all the suffering the invasion had inflicted upon their homeland. The plains of Guiju became a vast killing field, where the dreams of Khitan expansion died in pools of blood and scattered equipment. By the time the surviving Khitans reached the Yalu River, and the safety of their own territory, their once mighty army had been reduced to a few thousand broken survivors. Shapaya himself, the brilliant commander who had led the largest invasion force in Korean history, found his career destroyed and his reputation in ruins. He would be demoted and exiled for his failure, dying in disgrace far from the scenes of his former triumphs. The victory celebration that greeted Kang Gam-chan's return to the capital was unlike anything in Korean memory. King Hyunjong personally traveled to Yongpa Station to meet the returning hero, hosting a magnificent feast to honor the man who had saved the kingdom from its greatest peril. The image of the 70-year-old commander with 8 golden flowers adorning his hair became an enduring symbol of wisdom, triumphing over brute force. More than mere ceremony, the aftermath of Guiju represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power throughout East Asia. The Khitan Empire, faced with the reality that Korea could not be conquered at any acceptable cost, abandoned their dreams of peninsula domination. Future relations would be based on mutual respect rather than intimidation, with Goryeo maintaining its independence while acknowledging Khitan suzerainty in purely ceremonial terms. For Kang Gam-chan personally, the victory marked the culmination of an extraordinary life journey from provincial scholar to national savior. His elevation to the highest ranks of the governmental hierarchy, including appointments as Grand Guardian and Chancellor, represented not just personal honor, but recognition of the intellectual and strategic foundations that had made victory possible. Even in his final years,
His influence continued to shape Korean development. His proposal for the construction of defensive walls around the capital demonstrated his ongoing concern for national security. His appointment as chief minister under King Deokjong showed that his wisdom remained valued by successive generations of rulers. When death finally claimed him at the age of 84, the kingdom mourned the passing of its greatest hero. The court suspended normal business for 3 days, and all officials were required to attend his funeral. The posthumous title of Inhin honored not just his military achievements, but his embodiment of the scholarly virtues that Korean civilization held most dear. His legacy extended far beyond mere military victory. The Battle of Guiju had proven that intellectual brilliance, careful preparation, and strategic patience could triumph over seemingly overwhelming force. It established principles of defensive warfare that would influence Korean military thinking for centuries. Most importantly, it demonstrated that a small nation could maintain its independence against powerful neighbors through the application of superior wisdom and unshakable resolve. The boy born under a falling star had fulfilled the celestial prophecy that had marked his arrival. Through decades of study, service, and sacrifice, he had transformed himself from scholar to strategist to savior. The thunder that echoed across the plains of Guiju was not just the sound of battle, but the voice of history itself, proclaiming that some victories transcend mere military success to become eternal inspiration for all who face impossible odds with unconquerable courage. As we close this chapter of Whispered Memories, remember that within each of us lies the potential for transformation that defined Kang Gam-chan's remarkable life. The challenges we face may not involve armies and empires, but they require the same combination of wisdom, patience, and determination that carried a scholar's son from obscurity to immortal greatness. Close your eyes and let these whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep.